Before the Protect Illinois Communities Act was enacted, you had sheriffs across the state say that they are not going to enforce what they see as an unconstitutional law restricting individuals' Second Amendment rights. And sheriffs across the state said this. It wasn't just a handful. It was 90 plus of the 102 county sheriffs that said that they're not going to enforce this. And even the Illinois Sheriff's Association filing briefs that were in supportive of opposing the law. And you had as well a bunch of sheriffs hold a news conference talking about how they aren't going to enforce the Protect Illinois Communities Act. Here's the Crawford County Sheriff, along with other sheriffs from Southern Illinois. This is Crawford County Sheriff William Rutam. You also hear the Casper County Sheriff Brandon Francis, and others joining State Representative Adam Niemerg. And here's what they had to say about 3 months ago when it comes to the issues of whether or not they are going to enforce the state's gun and magazine ban.
I am a constitutional officer. I swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States first and foremost. And that me and several of the other sheriffs in the state, like most of us, and several state's attorneys, along with the Crawford County State's Attorney, have sent out these letters stating that we feel this law that has recently passed is unconstitutional, and how we do not want to, or how we are not going to enforce any of that law. So,
woke, progressive states' attorneys will not prosecute acts of gun violence in their counties. They'll call it mutual combat. Yet they will prosecute honest citizens who wish to exercise their constitutional right to keep and bear arms. And make no mistake about it, this new law infringes on the rights of honest citizens. It infringes their rights by preventing them from buying firearms that are legal in nearly every other state. It selectively applies our constitutional rights to certain citizens, but denies those rights to others. The new law essentially treats the Second Amendment like a privilege rather than a right, which is what it is. In our society, we don't provide the government a list of people who attend church or who are members of the local Rotary Club, because our Constitution gives us a right to freely assemble. We don't have to get permission from the government to exercise our rights, because to do so would contradict the very nature of what a right is. Honest citizens are not the ones causing gun violence. Stripping honest citizens of their rights won't solve the problem. More laws are not the solution. We must address the root cause of gun violence. We must help troubled youth get the mental health care they need, and we must, as a society, elevate and promote the family as the bedrock of who we are. Let's focus on real solutions, and let's stop infringing on the rights of honest citizens. Folks, our Second Amendment is not subject to a governor's political narrative or presidential aspirations. Thank you.
I'm Sheriff Brandon Francis from Jasper County. I don't have any fear from, not enforcing this. When I took my oath as sheriff, the second line in my oath was to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. I think we're all in agreement. There's several sheriffs that put out letters, in the majority of the state. I think it was around 90% of the sheriffs put out a statement stating that they would support the Constitution.
So again, that's some sheriffs and State Representative Adam Niemerg from 3 months ago talking about how they won't enforce the state's Protect Illinois Communities Act. And these are sheriffs, 90-plus sheriffs across the states making these statements several months ago. Well, U.S. Congressman Sean Casten from the Chicago suburbs, a Democrat, he held a Zoom forum over the weekend, and this is how that forum started off. with members of various organizations joining Casten via Zoom. And here's, again, how it started off.
Everyone, my name is Jason DeSanto, and I teach at the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law here in Chicago. Thanks so much for being with us tonight for this roundtable and panel on political extremism in America. Specifically, tonight we're going to examine the so-called constitutional sheriffs movement. As we'll hear, that movement, often framed in terms of liberty, may actually be a growing threat to liberty, to our constitutional system, and to our constitutional rights.
So they then go on to talk about the Protect Illinois Communities Act and why they're bringing up the issue of constitutional sheriffs as a possible threat.
As many of you know, in January of this year, the Illinois General Assembly passed and Governor Pritzker signed the Protect Illinois Communities Act. That act came about as a result of last year's July 4th mass shooting in Highland Park, Illinois, where a gunman killed 7 people and wounded 48 others. The law, among other things, banned the sale of distribution of assault weapons in our state. Now, Illinois has 102 counties. Within days after the law's enactment, the elected sheriffs of more than 90 of them declared unilaterally that they simply would not enforce that law. In their view as sheriffs, the law violated the Second Amendment of the Constitution, was invalid, and so would be treated by these sheriffs as invalid. In other words, the choice of whether this law, passed by a lawmaking body, really a law, was theirs and theirs alone. In short, what these Illinois sheriffs were doing was espousing the doctrine of the National Constitutional Sheriffs Movement, as it is called by these activists. And so it was and is that we're here tonight.
So the group then heard from U.S. Congressman Sean Casten, which we will get to after the break and hear from you as well at 217-629-7970. That's the phone number here with Springfield's Morning News. Again, 217-629-7970. Your thoughts on all of this coming up after we hear from U.S. Congressman Sean Casten about the issue he says is a dangerous group of constitutional sheriffs not willing to enforce a law that they see as unconstitutional. So stay tuned. We'll get to that coming up here with WMAY. And again, your phone calls at 217-629-7970. Illinois' constitutional sheriffs that say they won't enforce the state's gun ban are an extremist threat, according to a congressman from the Chicago suburbs, Congressman Sean Casten, holding a Zoom conference with a variety of individuals talking about what he says is the constitutional threat of local sheriffs not enforcing a gun ban. Here is, again, Sean Casten talking about this with a panel of others from over the weekend.
I called my own sheriff, who was one of the ones who was saying that he wouldn't enforce that, and asked him on what legal ground did he feel that he had the right not to enforce the law. And his comment to me was that because he took an oath to uphold the Constitution, he had a obligation not to enforce part of the Constitution that he didn't believe in. That led to a somewhat heated conversation when I reminded him that we did previously have an assault weapons ban in 1994. We had the same Constitution at the time. We had a National Firearms Act in 1934 that's still on the books, and we also have a Supreme Court that ultimately rules on it's constitutional. And at that point, he said, "Well, I got this from the Illinois Sheriff's Association, who really drafted the letter." And I'm not trying to relitigate that history, but I tell the story to tell you this one: that when I got back to D.C. the following week, I was coming up in the elevator in my office at Rayburn. My other colleagues who were back and, doing as we do, how was your week? And going on the district, how are things at home? And I was writing up with a Republican colleague, his name doesn't matter, but a Republican who represents a very rural state, not a person who we agree with a lot on a lot of political issues of the day. And he asked me how my week was. And I told him the story, and I said, I'm just really nervous because I'm trying to figure out what to do as a member of Congress when there are so many sheriffs in my home state who have basically taken a view that they have that they are literally the judge, jury, and executioner interpretation that's completely outside of our Constitution. And how do I communicate that? How do I fix this problem? And he looked at me and he said, the constitutional sheriff's movement is the most dangerous thing happening in America at this point. This was a Republican from a very rural state. And I had not at that point heard of the movement, but went through to do my homework.
Interesting that Casten chose not to name who that Republican was that he got that statement from, that the constitutional sheriffs are the most dangerous threats to this country. These constitutional sheriffs saying that they won't enforce what they see as unconstitutional laws, being the top law enforcement officer in each county. And again, we've got 90 plus sheriffs across the state that say that they won't enforce the state's gun and magazine ban. Then Casten went into what he saw as the history of these constitutional sheriffs.
This movement did not exist prior to 2011. It was started by a guy named Richard Mack. Richard Mack still around. And the thesis of the movement, as articulated, was that sheriffs are responsible for upholding the Constitution, and their powers supersede the power of any officer, employee, or elected official from any other level of government, from the president down to the local school board official, when they are in their own county. Now that's wildly at odds. You will not find that expressed anywhere in the Constitution that really exists.
So Ken then goes on to talk about the constitutional sheriffs that he says are linked to the Oath Keepers, and this is again, a group that was just recently had members found guilty of storming the Capitol on January 6th. Here's more of Sean Casten talking about the constitutional sheriffs that he sees as a threat to not just Illinois but the nation.
Richard Mack is also on the board of the Oath Keepers. You may know them from January 6th. The Oath Keepers, they are called the Oath Keepers because they asked their members to willingly violate any law that they believe violates the Constitution. When you are telling your members to willingly violate laws, it's perhaps not surprising that you get heavily involved in January 6th. And 9, I believe it's up to 9, of the Oath Keepers have now been convicted of seditious conspiracy, which is one charge lower than treason. Including their founder, Stuart Rhodes. Stuart Rhodes was previously a staffer to Rand Paul's father. There is a deep rot that this is tied into a lot of our system. 11% of the sheriffs in our country, according to a survey by the Marshall Project, support the Oath Keepers. This is a real problem. Now, Mack did not come up for this out of whole cloth. And the history, the idea, the germs of these ideas have been around arguably longer than our Constitution has.
And then Casten goes on to talk about post-Civil War and these ideas coming about, he says, were meant to block national laws about desegregation and a whole host of other things, seeming to say that, these constitutional sheriffs have a racist history. Here's, again, Sean Casten.
And so we have a long history in our country of local governments trying to create the ability to reinstitute the causes that we just fought a civil war over. And the proof of how contentious that was is that once we got through the Reconstruction era, Rutherford B. Hayes passed the Posse Comitatus Act, which is still in the books, which says that the federal military may not step in to enforce local laws. You sometimes hear some of these Oath Keepers, constitutional sheriffs refer to the Posse Comitatus. That's what that is. And so we had people fight back, which of course began all the horrors of the Jim Crow South and the KKK, where the local police chief was also the Grand Duke of the KKK. And there was a concern there. And I want to be very clear. I am not for a moment suggesting that the police are racist or tied to slavery. Quite to the contrary. What I am suggesting, though, is that there has always been in our history a direct link between white supremacy and the desire to expand the powers of local law enforcement at the expense of the federal government. And so there's a direct link in our country from slavery to the rise of the KKK in the Reconstruction era to the fact that there were policemen who were locking up Martin Luther King and civil rights protesters. Why was that happening? Why was it a big deal to call in the federal government so that Ruby Bridges could go to school? Right? There's this constant tension with local law enforcement, and there has been this push. And that tension is now being manifest in local law enforcement agencies or officials in local law enforcement agencies, I should say, who are saying, I don't think we should have mask mandates. I don't think we should have assault weapons bans. I don't think Joe Biden won the next election. And so I come back to the point that my rural Republican colleague made. The constitutional sheriff's moment is one of the scariest things in our democracy right now because it threatens the very existence of our democracy.
So again, Sean Casten, he gave kind of opening statements for this hour-long talk with 4 other people and talking about how he believes that the constitutional sheriff's movement is a dangerous threat to democracy, and we'll obviously be getting a response from the Illinois Sheriff's Association. It reached out way early this morning, so maybe we can connect with them later on today. I'll share that with you as I get it here on WMAY.